Okay, so moving on past our history portion of social studies, and looking at civics and government. And some of this will probably be familiar. We'll cover a little bit of ground, or review a little bit. Some of it will be because I talked about this along the way, particularly early on with sort of the formation of the United States and the early republic and things like that. And we'll also look at some maps, and start thinking about visualizing information on a map. And I have one up here behind us already, and I'll talk about that for just a second here as we go. So largely, on your GED exam, it'll be based around U.S. government, the types of questions that you might encounter. And so a little bit of background into that, and what does that mean? What kind of government do we have in the United States? How does it operate? So we'll dive into that a little bit. And for starters, we'll talk about the idea of a Western liberal democracy, which is what the United States is. And there's plenty of other Western liberal democracies around the world. And it's rooted in what I've talked about early on, the ideas that came from the Enlightenment period, from say the 1600s mostly, and early 1700s. These political thinkers, these philosophers, most of which were in Europe, mostly in France and Britain, although there are some in other places. We consider, the founding fathers as part of the American Enlightenment that comes later. But even they were informed by these political thinkers that had started contemplating, politics and government in their age, and thinking more about secular, ideas, moving away from religion and government and things like that, and ideas of civil liberties and civil rights and sort of this individualism. So that is, where our government it was greatly influenced by, and what the founding fathers were influenced by. So, what exactly is a Western liberal democracy then in today's world? So first off, I'm going to get this out of the way, because this is a fruitless and exhausting debate that a lot of knuckleheads want to get into about what exactly is the American government. And there are people out there that throw a hissy fit if you say we're a democracy. And they'll, be like, oh, no, we're a constitutional republic, or we're a representative republic. We're not a democracy. We are an indirect democracy. Okay. And there's been, in the idea of a direct democracy is largely antiquated. They really don't exist, right? So the word democracy it's a Greek word. It stems from demos, which is the common people, right? And oddly enough, we're going to do a lesson in language arts today on affixes, right? On suffixes and prefixes. Whenever you see ocracy, right, attached to something, it's the type of government or the way people are governed, right? So monarchy, usually has a king or an emperor, some type of single ruler that's responsible for most of those decisions. They may have, some type of governing body, but in a direct or pure monarchy, you have a king or something that makes most of the decisions. Autocracy, or what's another good one? A kleptocracy, which is basically a oligarchy, which is the rule by the elite, which a lot of times we feel that we live in, and there's a lot of criticism that we live in an oligarchy. Oligarchy probably would apply more to a place like Russia. But demos, right? The common people, government by the common people. And the reason people get all up in arms about that word is because, in a pure democracy, right, the people are basically the ones voting and are ruling. And it lends towards mob rule, right? The majority isn't always right. And but the idea there is largely just, it's semantics, and in today's world, it's a waste of time. So, whatever you want to call it, a constitutional republic, a representative democracy, a representative republic, whatever, you want to call it, as an indirect democracy, we elect lawmakers in a democratic process that's by the people. There are some countries that lean more towards a direct democracy. Switzerland, for example. There are parts of the US, and there are times in the US that we have more direct democracy in action. So when you go to your local polls, which today is a primary day, which we'll kind of get into a little bit, oftentimes there'll be, votes on like tax levies for schools and things like that. So there is sometimes more of a direct nature. In Denmark now, the people can actually introduce bills in their legislative branch. If they basically they have an online system, and you can basically introduce a bill, and if it gets enough votes by the people, then their body of parliament or Congress, whatever it is, will actually introduce it to their legislative branch. But again, that is sort of modern idea of democracy. No, we don't all, spend our days, voting on every little issue that comes about. We are an indirect democracy. But in every political argument or in the technical sense, we are considered a democracy. So as a Western liberal democracy, one of the important ideas under that is the separation of powers. So we have several branches of government that are co-equal. They have, in theory or even in practice, I really should say in practice, they have all have limited power and are equal under the law and the Constitution. Anywhere around the world, we have similar ideas. In Britain, they have Parliament. Of course, they have a head of state there. And then, anywhere where there's this idea of Western liberal democracy, you typically have your power separated into multiple branches of government, whatever that may be. Pretty standard, though, to have something along the lines of the United States, where you have a judicial branch, right? So their purpose and their responsibilities are applying the law to real situations, and then determining if laws are constitutional. And we talked about them from time to time in rulings that go to the Supreme Court. There's various levels underneath the Supreme Court, but just using that as an example at the federal level, at the highest level, there are cases and lawsuits and things that make their way to the Supreme Court, which will often set a precedent depending on the ruling there, and it kind of becomes the law of the land. But we mentioned, like Plessy versus Ferguson in the late 1800s, which basically made the idea of separate but equal the law in the United States, and then Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which overruled that. So you see, that's actual application of the law in real situations. And then, as part of the rest of the branches of government, if a bill is passed, then the Supreme Court looks at it to make sure that it follows the Constitution, and that it is constitutional. There are, in every state in the United States, a similar setup as far as branches of government. And they have their own kind of Supreme Court. And then, of course, a legislative branch, and then they have an executive, which is usually, is the governor. In every 50 state, they have a governor. And typically, they have a bicameral legislative branch. I've mentioned this before. Bicameral means there are two chambers. Right, so we have a House of Representatives and a U.S. Senate, U.S. House and U.S. Senate. So, okay, and every state has a similar bicameral legislative branch, except for Nebraska, which only has one. They have a monocameral legislative branch. Why? I don't know. But it still has that separation of powers between a judicial branch and executive branch, but they only have one chamber. The legislative branch, its main duty is to make laws. And we're going to talk mostly about the legislative branch today and some of the other responsibilities that it has, but it introduces bills, and it is up to, at the federal level, for Congress to pass those bills. So whether it's introduced in the House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, both chambers must vote on that bill, and then that bill will go to the president, who will then either sign it into law or veto it, which will then get returned to to Congress to either modify it so it'll pass, or if they get a certain majority of votes, then it no longer requires the president to sign it into law, and it becomes law. And along the way, of course, if there's an issue, the Supreme Court will look at it. It's like, either strike it down or say, yay, this meets the standards of the Constitution. And then we got our executive branch. So one thing a little bit different about the executive branch, there's only one elected official in that in the executive branch. Of course, that's the President of the United States. He has a cabinet of secretaries that are in charge of various parts of the federal government. Overall, their responsibility is to enforce laws, sign treaties. The president is sort of as the head of state, is sort of the chief diplomat for the United States. And we talked about this through the course of history, thinking about Richard Nixon, who went to China to meet with their heads of state. He went to Moscow, and of course that has happened numerous times since then. Donald Trump went to and technically went into North Korea, where he crossed the demilitarized zone and met what's his name? We just talked about him not that long ago. Kim Jong-un. And which was really a historic event, but that's part of their duties as well. We talked about World War II, FDR and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin all meeting together, right? That was part of his duties. The executive, the president is the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. So he can declare war. That also takes some Congress approval, but he can make those declarations, and is basically the chief officer of the armed forces as well. And then just generally governing, right? They set an agenda. They can write bills that have to be introduced in Congress by somebody in Congress, but they can actually write bills, which they have done in the past. They are sort of expected to work with the legislative branch in particular to get laws passed, and of course they have the final say a lot of times with those laws by being the one that can either sign it into law or veto it, where it goes back to Congress. And we'll get into each of those individual roles here as we move along. And then along with separation of powers, Western liberal democracies tend to be open societies. We tend to have a transparency in our governments with journalists, and that also means that we tend to have fairly liberal immigration policies. If you want to become an American citizen, that could be a difficult matter as far as the hoops you have to jump through and things like that. But we are, truly a melting pot, as the saying goes. We have a lot of people come here. There are, the opposite of that would be a closed society that has very, very limited amount of immigration. They are also, not transparent. We don't know a lot of times what's going on in that country. I mentioned, North Korea is maybe the most closed society on the planet. People do not immigrate to North Korea. And we don't know a lot about what goes on inside the country because they're a very closed society. But it goes along with the idea of sort of an openness. And then we champion and we support the ideas of civil liberties, civil rights, human rights. Now, that can certainly, a point of contention as far as how we conduct that from time to time. But generally speaking, that is, a facet of Western liberal democracy. And along with that, it tends to be a sense of individualism. And we talked about, some of these other societies, we spend a lot of time talking about, say, like the Soviet Union or fascism, for example, where it was really the state over the people. So there is one comparison or contrast you can see between what's considered a Western liberal democracy and some of the other types of government around the world, where individualism and the support of civil rights, civil liberties is less important than sort of the overall good of the state. Some other facets of Western liberal democracies tend to be market economies, drives the prices. So individuals and corporations basically decide what the price of goods and services are going to be, and that's driven by a market, right? It's kind of driven by supply and demand. Whereas in stricter socialist countries, the government often sets prices. That was part of the issue with the fall of communism, is Gorbachev trying to open up more towards a market economy, and almost overnight had this mass inflation hit the Soviet Union at towards the end of its days, which was another reason that some of these former Soviets decided to split off from the USSR. Couple more things. Rule of law. The rule of law applies to everybody equally. All are accountable to the law. So whether it's our head of state, whether it's the president, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's the Supreme Court, right down to Joe Schmo on the street, the law applies equally to everybody. Whereas, in a monarchy or stuff like that, there's a lot of privilege there. So obviously in a dictatorship or something like that, you can't necessarily try the leader of that country for crimes and things like that. So rule of law applies equally. And finally, with most of these, and of course, even with other types of government, there is a governing document that the state tries to adhere to when it comes to ruling, when it comes to governance, when it comes to making new laws. So that's basically the idea behind Western liberal democracy. Now, talking a little more specifically about our branches of government. And today we'll probably just get through the legislative branch, right? And so the U.S. Congress, as I mentioned before, it's a bicameral legislative body, meaning there are two chambers. There is what's considered the lower body or lower chamber, which is the House of Representatives, and there's 435 members. There's actually a few empty seats right now, but that is the max number that you will have, and we're going to talk about how that works and why we have that number and how those members are selected. The upper body is the U.S. Senate, and there's 100 members. There are 2 senators from each state, right? We have 50 states, 2 senators, 100 members. The House of Representatives are elected to 2-year terms. So every 2 years, you have to get either reelected or you get voted out. The U.S. Senate is a 6-year term. And just to make things easier, those are offset in each state. So I've mentioned this before too. There's a Senate race this year in the state of Ohio. It's basically coming down to J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan is the way it looks. So we have one this year for that Senate seat, and 3 years from now, there'll be an election for the other Senate seat, which is held by Sherrod Brown right now. And he may run again, who knows. But either way, so you don't have, a complete changeover or having to deal with 2 elections. Those are offset. Every 3 years we have a senatorial election. Your term though is for 6 years. In both cases, whether it's U.S. House of Representatives or U.S. Senate, there are no term limits. So, for example, if I wanted to run for Senate or House of Representatives and I get elected, I can run until I die. I can run until I'm in my 90s, and that has happened. So there's no term limits. You can keep running, and we do have, members that have been there just about as long as I've been alive. What do they do? So, as I mentioned, the idea, sort of their main mission for the legislative body, that's both houses, they make laws that influence our daily lives, right? They hold hearings to inform the legislative process. We've had this January 6th commission where they've been holding hearings here for a while now. The purpose of that, I mentioned before, we talked about the McCarthy trials. We talked about the House Committee on Un-American Activities, whatever it was called. Those are, as it says, to inform the legislative process. So they're trying to gain information in the attempt to possibly pass some type of legislation to either prevent something or promote something. And those go on all the time. And there is a number of committees, both in the Senate and in the House, that look at different aspects of our society, whether it's defense, whether it's, social issues, law enforcement. There's all kinds of these committees, and they will hold hearings about a given subject. One that was fairly recent was this idea about veterans exposed to burn piles while they were serving, and the issues, health issues that have come up with these soldiers that were exposed to burn piles where they're in. And a lot of times they'll have very famous people that come to speak at those events. Jon Stewart was on Capitol Hill during some of those hearings and was speaking. He also did that for a recent bill for 9/11 survivors, emergency workers that were exposed to, chemicals and things, and the smoke and irritants that affected their health after particularly in New York when the World Trade Centers collapsed. But, they hold these hearings and everything. And along with that, they conduct investigations to oversee the executive branch. So we talked about impeachment, and I'm going to get into that a little bit when we talk about the individual branches, how that works. But yes, they sort of oversee the executive branch to make sure that everything is on the up and up with our president. We did talk about that a little bit when it came to Nixon. And I also mentioned things like a constitutional crisis when the rule of law is not being followed by the president, when they don't turn over evidence and things like that. And then largely, right, they are our elected officials. So they serve as the voice of the people and the states in the federal government. So we have elected officials. That is who's representing us in our U.S. government, and they are supposed to basically conduct our will and interests in our name. And of course, you can write your senators, you can write your representatives You can also write them if you want to go visit the Capitol. A couple of years ago, my wife and I took my daughter to the Capitol, and we contacted Sherrod Brown's office. It was on kind of one of those slow, long weekends, and we were, invited to his office. He wasn't there, but one of the interns took us across the street. Well, we actually got to ride the little tram under. There's a tunnel that takes them from the office building where a lot of the senators work, and a little tram that goes under the street and into the Capitol building. And then we got a tour from one of Brown's interns. So, they are there for you. And that is one way that we can exercise our, will, is to, write them I've written senators before when things come up. So, that's their job. And then finally, they oversee and pass budgets for the federal government. So that's usually a point of contention, trying to get things done. There have been years that we did not have a budget, and that's often used by both either the president or the legislative branch to sort of hold the government hostage by not being able to come to an agreement on a budget. Sequestration. You may have heard that term in the past, and that's when there's not an agreement on the budget, so they freeze spending for a lot of federal offices, and only the most emergency type of offices are funded, and that's when you often get a government shutdown when they can't pass a budget. But whether it's defense spending or law enforcement or social programs, whatever it is, there has to be a budget passed, and that is the responsibility of the Congress. So diving in a little bit to the House of Representatives and how do we elect those people? And why is there 400, what did I say, 35? Yeah, 435 members. So here we go. I'll talk a little bit about our map here too. So for starters, unlike the Senate, which just has 2 seats per state, the House of Representatives is apportioned based on population. Okay, so the U.S. Census occurs every 10 years, and this is one reason that's really, really important. So if you have to take a survey, the U.S. Census determines how many people are in the country and where they live. That's one of their most important jobs. So as the country grew, we added representatives to the House. It wasn't always 435. As the population grew, we added more and more, and of course we added more states along the way. In 1911, that number was capped at 435. At that point, they're like, we're not adding anymore. That's it. Part of the problem, though, with that is that the population is still increasing, right? Still growing. Every year we got more people. But not everywhere, as my wife just said. The thing is, when back in the day, we had in 1911 we had 435. The amount of constituents, right? So the constituents are the people that the people in Congress represent. It was in the tens of thousands that each member of the House actually represented. Today, each member of the House represents, on an average, over 760,000 constituents. So what happens is that through the U.S. Census, we determine where people are living, and that changes, obviously, right? So some places the population grows, and some places the population shrinks. So every 10 years, there's reapportionment of the House of Representatives. Okay, so there's redistricting that's involved. Now, the map I have here is for U.S. congressional districts for next year. Okay, so let's talk about maps for a minute here. So there's basically 5 elements that maps typically have. They'll not always have all 5, but first off, you'll have a title, right? Just like when we look at charts and tables or any other data or a whole passage of text, it's going to have a title to tell you what's going on. Also, you're going to have some type of map key or legend. So down in the corner, you'll see these different colors here, these different shades. And so a map key or legend is going to tell you what the symbols or colors on the map mean, right? Sometimes it might be something like this where it's shading. They may have map symbols. You know, a lot of times there's a lot of agreed upon sort of symbols. So if you see a star on a state, that usually represents the capital of that state. So, you know, here in Columbus, around the middle of the state, we would have a little star. Major cities would be like a larger dot, while little smaller cities will have like a tiny dot. But they will also have that information a lot of times in legend or key. This map doesn't have, you know, other features. What also you will often see on a map is a compass rose, which is telling you which way is north. You know, sometimes they're really fancy and ornate. Sometimes it's just an arrow that shows north this way. Fun fact, okay? Nearly every map that you see, this is sort of like, remember we talked about line graphs, and your independent variable usually is on the horizontal line, and your dependent variable is on the left, running up and down. Same holds true for maps. 99.9999999% of maps that you encounter are going to be north oriented, north to south oriented. You're not going to have to worry about in your social studies test having a upside down U.S. map to look at where north is down instead of up. You know, most of the time you're going to see a map that is going to be north is oriented up, right? So up and down. Some other features that you'll often see will be a scale to show you what length is represented on the map. Sometimes that is a ratio, like the scale of this map will be, you know, 100 to 1 or whatever it is. Or it'll be like a small measuring tool, right? You've probably seen those before. It'll be like a little black and white strip, and it'll have on there like, you know, so many inches represents so many miles on the map. And I'll show you some maps tomorrow that have those kind of features on it. And finally, another element of a map oftentimes is a grid system that'll show you lines of longitude and lines of latitude. And the easiest way to remember longitude and longitude runs long ways, up and down. Latitude runs lengthways. So anyway, getting back to the map here. So those 435 House of Representative members are apportioned every 10 years based on population. This is one reason the U.S. Census is so important. So what happens, right? So they look at these numbers and determine, you know, what population grew in what state, in what communities, and where did population shrink. So our legend over here, right? That dark green color shows you that that state gained 2 seats in the House of Representatives for next year, right? We're going through elections, you know, right now. So the lighter green shade shows you they gained 1 seat. The grays show you that there was no change. And then the yellow shows you that there was a loss of 1 seat. So no state lost more than 1 seat, right? But we do see a number of states that lost at least 1. So, for example, our state of Ohio, right, lost a seat. And there has been redistricting going on in Ohio to shuffle things around, to, reapportion those districts now that we have one less representative for next year. This is another point of contention. This is where the activity of gerrymandering comes into play. So you've probably heard that term before. You've definitely heard it in Ohio if you turn on the news at any point of the day, probably. Gerrymandering is the activity of sort of carving out voting districts in order to get the voters you want and enough of the other voters that you don't want, so you can skew the voting towards your political party and your candidate, right? So if you look at, if you go and Google Ohio congressional maps, first off, you're going to see 100 news stories about how the state Supreme Court in Ohio keeps overturning the maps that the Ohio Assembly keeps sending them because they're unconstitutional and they are gerrymandered. So I'll give you an example of what that means. Get a drink of water. When I lived in Athens a couple years ago, our U.S. representative was Steve Stivers. And I think my wife's probably rolling her eyes right now. So Stivers was the 15th Ohio congressional district. Now, Athens is 2-3 counties away, right? 70 miles or so. Steve Stivers also has neighborhoods all through Franklin County. And if you look at that 15th district, there's a big kind of chunky block that kind of makes sense. And then there's all these little neighborhoods, all these weird zigzagging lines, not zigzagging, but weird shapes that make his district. Athens itself is a very liberal county for the most part, particularly around the city of Athens. You have the university and everything. It's largely a Democratic voting area. So Stivers has that, so he gets to sort of eat up that little bit of and Stivers is a Republican. But then he also carves out a big section of Republican voting, traditionally, historically Republican voting neighborhoods, to undermine, for one, the Democratic voters in Ohio, while getting more Republican voters for him, right? And that is accomplished through these really crazy looking districts that are created. And that is a big, big fight right now in Ohio. The Supreme Court in Ohio keeps overturning these maps. There's a primary today in Ohio for a number of districts. People don't even know what their districts are. People are not even sure where they're supposed to be voting. It's a really, really troubling issue. And of course, Ohio is not the only state that's guilty of doing that. It's also not one party. It's recently been Republicans that have been more guilty of it because of their control of certain parts of state governments. But I'm not going to sit here and say that it's all a Republican issue. There are certainly Democrats that have done this before as well. But anyway, so they have to reapportion those districts. So you see Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, Indiana, California, they all lost a seat, and those seats went to Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Denver's a city, Colorado, and Oregon. So those states too have to reapportion their districts so they can vote a new representative to the Congress. Another issue with some of these states, particularly Wyoming. Now, you'll see Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Alaska all only have one representative. Montana was like that, right? But they actually gained a seat. Most of those, I think, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, have around that number of 760,000 constituents, right? Wyoming, the entire state of Wyoming, that huge state of Wyoming, that entire big block, has less population by a half than Franklin County. The county you live in, the county of Columbus and the surrounding area, or Columbus and the surrounding area, has about 1.3 million people. Wyoming, that entire state, has a little over 500,000. So technically, in reality, it does not have enough people to even have a representative in Congress, in the House of Representatives. But what they call it is the representative at large. So there's one big voting district for those states. It's not like a 15th district where you're going to vote for this particular candidate. They have one person that they vote in. They still have 2 senators, and that is a bit of a problem too, because you can make a case that they're overrepresented. Yeah, my wife's shaking her head over there, nodding her head. Where else does this become an issue? When it comes to the Electoral College. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the election of the president, which is a little bit different, but that's where the census comes into play as well. Because the Electoral College is based on how many House of Representative members there are and how many senators there are. So population and those census are really, really important when it comes to elections. So that's my spiel on how House of Representative members are elected, right? We go through this whole census process every 10 years, then those seats are apportioned, and then every 2 years they are, we have elections to elect those representatives. Each chamber of the legislative branch has some unique responsibilities. That is the U.S. Capitol there in the background. On the one side, you sort of have the House chamber, the Representative chamber, where they meet, and on the other side is the Senate chamber. First off, as we talked about, passage of federal legislation. So either branch of the legislative, either chamber, I should say, of the legislative branch can introduce legislation. Wherever it starts, that it's voted on there, then it goes to the other chamber. Once it's passed there, then it goes to the president. Couple things, or a few things that are specific to each chamber. So for the House of Representatives, what else do they do that the other chamber doesn't do, that the Senate doesn't do? First off, they initiate all revenue bills. So what does that mean? They're the ones that write tax law. So when it comes to taxation, when it comes to revenue that is generated by the U.S. government, it starts in the House of Representatives. That's where it starts. I mentioned also, right, there's a lower chamber and an upper chamber. So traditionally, the way we think about those, the lower chamber kind of has less power and influence. Okay. For one, they're larger, so each individual member doesn't have quite as much influence. And they're there for a shorter time, theoretically, because they're only elected for 2 years. It's where a lot of politicians get their start. They start off as representatives, and then maybe senators, and then the president or what have you. But the Senate seems to be the upper chamber, and that is kind of replicated around the world. So Parliament, in Britain, you have the House of Commons, which is the lower house there. But that doesn't mean that there's not some really, really influential people there. And in a lot of cases, as a entire entity, they do have a lot of influence. I mean, they pass laws, right? So some of those other responsibilities. So they start with tax legislation. They also are responsible for impeaching federal officers. So obviously under that is going to be president, but any other type of federal officer. They can impeach judges and other, offices of federal government. They start the impeachment hearings, right? So if you are impeached, and remember, I've talked about this. We'll talk about this on the Senate side too. You are impeached by the House of Representatives. Okay. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump. Those are the 4 presidents who have been impeached. The 3 presidents who have been impeached, one of which was twice. And finally, a very interesting responsibility for the House of Representatives. They elect the president if no candidate receives a majority of votes. So, mention the Electoral College and electoral votes. I'll talk about that when we get to the president tomorrow. But to become president of the United States, you need 270 electoral votes. And we'll talk about how that's kind of calculated. But 270 votes. Now, let's say the year's 2055. And we'll talk about a dystopian future in the United States. And somehow there's like 4 really good candidates that pull away all these votes. So no one of these candidates reaches 270 electoral votes. Then it would be up to the House of Representatives to elect that president. They were probably based on whoever did get the most votes that got closest to 270. But anyway, that's one of their responsibilities. There are also some, officers and various, offices within the House of Representatives. Speaker of the House is one of those. It is sort of the leader of the House of Representatives. Currently, that is Nancy Pelosi. And they are not just sort of the overall leader of the House, but they tend to be the party leader. So she's a Democrat, and that they vote on who's going to be the Speaker of the House. So whoever is the majority in the chamber at that time. So right now, Democrats hold the majority, so they vote for their Speaker of the House. The Republicans do too. Everybody votes for Speaker, and of course they put up their own nominee. But typically, because one side has a majority, they're the ones that are going to wind up electing the Speaker of the House. It is an influential position. It's more administrative. They work with building officials and stuff like that, and the sergeant at arms and conduct of House hearings and things like that. They are also second in line of succession to the president. So vice president, right? If something happens to the president, vice president becomes president. If something would happen to the vice president, or something simultaneously happened to the president and the vice president, Speaker of the House becomes president. I will put up a table of the line of succession. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit tomorrow when we get to the presidency. Then there's a House minority and majority leader. So that's typically a senior member of the House of Representatives, somebody that has served for a while, somebody that's respected, and they have various duties sort of depending on the year, and the rules are set up for bills and stuff like that, debate. But there are some duties that they have. And then finally, one of the other major offices in the House of Representatives are majority and minority whips. And the whip is kind of like a manager. So they make sure that their party's bills are getting moved to the floor for votes and for debate. They make sure that representatives show up on voting days. So they kind of are, duck herders. They keep everybody moving the same direction for their party, and making sure that bills are getting on the floor and things like that. And of course, there are various committees, as I mentioned, that are assigned to representatives. Incoming representatives will get assigned to committees. Sometimes there's votes. They punish representatives sometimes when they do stupid things. They'll take them off committees to sort of marginalize their influence and some of their connections. So you kind of, there's, again, it's politics, and it's not just about passing bills and working with the opposing party, but within your own party, there's certainly a lot of politics too. So that's the House of Representatives. Briefly here, we'll talk about the Senate before we take a break. So the U.S. Senate, as I mentioned, 6-year terms, and just like the House of Representatives, you can get elected until you die. There are some qualifications. I should have mentioned that, but I think they're the same for the House and the Senate. So you have to be at least 25 years old, I believe. I think you don't have to be a natural born citizen, right? So as long as you're a naturalized citizen, as long as you've pledged your oath and become a citizen, at that point you can become a senator or a representative. Responsibilities, obviously, again, passage of legislation, first and foremost, passing bills. Approval of treaties. So the president could sign a treaty, but it's up to the Senate to agree on that. Another large responsibility, and this also becomes a point of contention a lot of times, is the confirmation of certain federal offices. So all of the president's cabinet secretaries, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, the Attorney General, on and on and on, go through confirmation hearings, and the Senate has to vote on them. From time to time, with cabinet secretaries, there is some pushback by the Senate that they don't want, a person serving. And by and large, though, they tend to play ball when it comes to cabinet secretaries, as long as it's not some type of real controversy with who they're appointing. Federal judges. Now that does become a point of contention, as we mentioned with the Supreme Court. So the president nominates a Supreme Court justice when there is a seat empty. There are 9 justices, and we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow when we talk about the president. We'll talk about the Supreme Court, but there are 9 justices. When there is a vacant spot, typically because somebody dies, because that is a lifetime appointment as a Supreme Court judge, they also have confirmation hearings. So that's been an issue for various reasons over the course of the last several years, going back to the Obama administration. When what was his name? Antonin Scalia died towards the end of Obama's administration. With the vacant seat there, Barack Obama appointed Merrick Garland, and the Senate, being a Republican majority, refused to give him a hearing. They declined at all to even have a hearing for him. And their reasoning was that this was basically with an upcoming election. Now, the election hadn't even happened yet. It was during the presidential race, that it should be the will of the people to decide the next Supreme Court justice, right? But it was simply just to block him, so that if a Republican president won, which is exactly what happened, then they would get to fill that seat. And of course, typically with that issue, a Democratic president is going to appoint a more liberal justice, and a Republican is going to appoint a more conservative justice. So during Donald Trump's presidency, he appointed 3 justices. There were 3 turnovers, one of which was the Antonin Scalia seat that was not filled during the Obama presidency. And then another justice retired, can't remember his name. And then, of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. So then we had Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and Gorsuch, Neil Gorsuch. And of course, Gorsuch went straight through. There was very little pushback on his nomination. Kavanaugh, of course, there was allegations of sexual assault when he was younger that held up his confirmation for a few weeks. But Amy Coney Barrett also fairly easily, went through the process, largely because there was a Republican majority that didn't hold it up. But again, there's other positions that it's political, it's politicized. But there's also other federal offices that they will confirm. So ambassadors, for instance, or other, federal offices. So I think the Surgeon General of the United States, we just talked about. So ranking officials in Homeland Security and some of the other federal offices. And so that's their role. And then there's a couple important senior leadership roles in the Senate. So the Vice President of the United States has an important role within the U.S. Senate. They are the presiding officer. They're considered the president of the Senate. And it's largely sort of, it's sort of like the Speaker of the House. They don't have a lot of duties. They oversee, debates sometimes, and they show up on voting days and things like that. Their biggest role, however, is casting a vote in the case of a tie. So we have 100 senators, right? And right now, that is a pretty darn close split between Democrats, Republicans, there's a few independents. But let's say we have a 50-50 vote, right? So 50 senators vote one way on something, 50 senators vote another way on something. The vice president gives a breaking tie vote. That's one of their roles. Another important office is the president pro tem, which basically fills in for the vice president if they're not available. So vice president has a lot of other duties. So the president pro tem is pretty active as far as that, but they are a full member of the Senate. So they would vote and just basically fill in for other duties. They obviously can break a tie because they've already voted. Of course, we know the vice president is the next in line of succession after the president. President pro tem is after the Speaker of the House. And the reasoning is basically that there are more people voted into the House of Representatives. So it's more the voice of the people that have put the Speaker of the House in that position, so to speak, where the president pro tem, there's less involvement there. All right. So that is a crash course in the legislative branches of the federal government and how they work. And we'll talk a little bit more about how bills are passed. We get to the presidency and we see his role. So we'll talk about executives, the executive branch, and probably get to the judicial branch tomorrow. And along the way, I will show you some different forms of maps. Something else I want to say about maps. There are several types. For starters, let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. What we saw today is a political map. So a political map shows political boundaries, or the boundaries of states, for example, in our case with the map, or countries. There's physical maps, which show geographic or geologic, I should say, features. So mountains and terrain and lakes. Now you'll realize a lot of maps will kind of combine these features. You may have, state borders on a more of a physical map. There's meteorological maps that are designed to, show movements of, pressure systems and cloud coverage and things like that. Again, they may have political borders too. They often do. If you watch the evening news, you see your local weather station or weather advisories and things like that. They will have like, Columbus outlined maybe, or, things like that, counties. Road maps, of course, is another form that will have maybe features on it. And then finally, there's topographical maps, which are sort of like physical maps that have, geologic features on them. But they also have contour lines that you can measure to show the height of mountaintops and things like that. So the contour lines, will curve around to give you a indication of the terrain. And the closer those are together, the steeper the incline is. And the farther apart the contour lines are, will show, a more gradual incline. And they're used a lot by surveyors and, hikers and stuff like that from time to time. But anyways, we'll take a look at some of those tomorrow and some more map features. But anyway, before we take a quick break here, any questions on the U.S. government, the federal government, and the legislative branch?
So how do any state lose a seat?
So just based on population, so on our map there, we saw that West Virginia, for example, lost a representative, right? Or coming up for 2023, they're going to lose a representative. Since I was a kid in West Virginia, growing up there in the 1980s, the population of West Virginia has slowly been leaving. They've been going to North Carolina. They've been going to Ohio. And there's actually less people living in the entire state of West Virginia than there are in Franklin County at this point. It's lost about 900,000 people probably over the last 20 or so years. So as those people, move to new locations, that's where the census every 10 years look at where those people live now, and then they reapportion how many House of Representatives seats based on where those people live. Same thing in Ohio. We lost one seat. So the population of Ohio has dropped some, where it's raised in other places. So they've gained seats while we've lost one. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Any other questions?
Yeah, how do you identify the states on the map?
I am glad you said that.
Yeah, that I also want to know.
Yeah.
So it's a good idea to learn the location and names of the states. I have what I'll put up on Google Classroom is a practice map that has a numbered map, right? And it has blanks below where you can fill it in. I have just a US map with all the names of the states on there to help you learn. And I have a video that will also help you learn the states. So I'll just have to scroll back through Google Classroom, and I will put those up today and tomorrow. I'll just go ahead and throw them on both days to help you learn. I know that's difficult. It's something, of course, I've been learning states for 47 years. And if that's not something that you've had to do, it can be a bit of a challenge. So yeah, I will definitely help you guys with that. Anything else?
No.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead. We'll take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll hop over into language arts for some advanced affixes and roots today. So I'll see you guys at about 10. We'll go to about 1:35 for our break. All right. All right. Bye.
Thank you.